The new Ad-Hocracy. The high rate of turnover is most dramatically symbolised by the rapid rise of what executives call project or task force management. Here, teams are assembled to solve specific short-term problems. Then, exactly like the mobile playgrounds, they are disassembled and their human components reassigned. Sometimes these teams are thrown together to serve only for a few days. Sometimes they are intended to last a few years. But unlike the functional departments or divisions of a traditional bureaucratic organisation, which are presumed to be permanent, the project or task force team is temporary by design. When Lockheed Aircraft Corporation won a controversial contract to build 58 giant C-5A military air transports, it created a whole new 11,000-man organisation specifically for the purpose. To complete the multi-billion-dollar job, Lockheed had to coordinate the work not only of its own people, but of hundreds of subcontracting firms. In all, 6,000 companies are involved in producing the more than 120,000 parts needed for each of these enormous aeroplanes. The Lockheed Project organisation, created for this purpose, has its own management and its own complex internal structure. The first of the C-5As rolled out of the shop exactly on schedule in March 1969, 29 months after award of the contract. The last of the 58 transports was due to be delivered 2 years later. This meant that the entire imposing organisation created for this job had a planned lifespan of 5 years. What we see here is nothing less than the creation of a disposable division, the organisational equivalent of paper dresses or throwaway tissues. Project organisation is widespread in the aerospace industries. When a leading manufacturer set out to win a certain large contract from the National Aeronautics and Space Agency, it assembled a team of approximately 100 people borrowed from various functional divisions of the company. The project team worked for about a year and a half to gather data and analyse the job even before the government formally requested bids. When the time came to prepare a formal bid, a proposal as it is known in the industry, the pre-proposal project team was dissolved and its members sent back to their functional divisions. A new team was brought into being to write the actual proposal. Proposal writing teams often work together for a few weeks. Once the proposal is submitted, however, the proposal team is also disbanded. When the contract is won, if indeed it is, new teams are successfully established for development and ultimately production of the goods required. Some individuals may move along with the job, joining each successive project team. Typically, however, people are brought in to work on only one or a few stages of the job. While this form of organisation is widely identified with aerospace companies, it is increasingly employed in more traditional industries as well. It is used when the task to be accomplished is non-routine, when it is, in effect, a one-time proposition. In just a few years, says Business Week, the project manager has become commonplace. Indeed, project management has itself become recognised as a specialised executive art, and there is a small but growing band of managers, both in the US and Europe, who move from project to project, company to company, never settling down to run routine or long-term operations. Books on project and task force management are beginning to appear, and the US Air Force Systems Command at Dayton, Ohio, runs a school to train executives for project management. Task forces and other ad hoc groups are now proliferating throughout the government and business bureaucracies, both in the US and abroad. Transient teams, whose members come together to solve a specific problem and then separate, are particularly characteristic of science and help account for the kinetic quality of the scientific community. Its members are constantly on the move, organisationally, if not geographically. George Kosmetsky, co-founder of Teledyne Incorporated, are now Dean of the School and now Dean of the School of Business at the University of Texas, distinguishes between routine and non-routine organisations. The latter grapple most frequently with one-of-a-kind problems. He cites statistics to show that the non-routine sector, in which he brackets government and many of the advanced technology companies, is growing so fast that it will employ 65% of the total US workforce by the year 2001. Organisations in this sector are precisely the ones that rely most heavily on transient teams and task forces. Clearly, there is nothing new about the idea of assembling a group to work towards the solution of a specific problem, then dismantling it when the task is completed. What is new is the frequency with which organisations must resort to such temporary arrangements. The seemingly permanent structures of many large organisations, often because they resist change, are now heavily infiltrated with these transient cells. On the surface, the rise of temporary organisations may seem insignificant, yet this mode of operation plays havoc with the traditional conception of organisation as consisting of more or less permanent structures. Throwaway organisations, ad hoc teams or committees do not necessarily replace permanent functional structures, but they change them beyond recognition, draining them of both people and power. Today, while functional divisions continue to exist, more and more project teams, task forces and similar organisational structures spring up in their midst, then disappear. And people, instead of filling fixed slots in the functional organisations, move back and forth at a high rate of speed. They often retain their functional home base, but are detached repeatedly to serve as temporary team members. We shall shortly see that this process, repeated often enough, alters the loyalties of the people involved, shakes up lines of authority, and accelerates the rate at which individuals are forced to adapt to organisational change. For the moment, however, it is important to recognise that the rise of ad hoc organisation is a direct effect of the speed up of change in society as a whole. So long as a society is relatively stable and unchanging, the problems it presents to men tend to be routine and predictable. Organisations in such an environment can be relatively permanent, but when change is accelerated, more and more novel first-time problems arise, and traditional forms of organisation prove inadequate to the new conditions. They can no longer cope. As long as this is so, says Dr. Donald A. Schon, President of the Organisation for Social and Technical Innovation, we need to create self-destroying organisations. Lots of autonomous, semi-attached units which can be spun off, destroyed, sold when the need for them has disappeared. Traditional functional organisation structures created to meet predictable, non-novel conditions prove incapable of responding effectively to radical changes in the environment. Thus, temporary role structures are created as the whole organisation struggles to preserve itself and keep growing. The process is exactly analogous to the trend towards modularism in architecture. We earlier defined modularism as the attempt to lend greater durability to a whole structure by shortening the lifespan of its components. This applies to organisations as well, and it helps explain the rise of short-lived or throwaway organisational components. As acceleration continues, organisational redesign becomes a continuing function. According to management consultant Bernard Muller-Thym, THYM, the new technology combined with advanced management techniques creates a totally new situation. What is now within our grasp, he says, is a kind of productive capability that is alive with intelligence, alive with information, so that at its maximum it is completely flexible. One could completely reorganize the plant from hour to hour if one wished to do so. And what is true of the plant is increasingly true of the organisation as a whole. In short, the organisational geography of super-industrial society can be expected to become increasingly kinetic, filled with turbulence and change. The more rapidly the environment changes, the shorter the lifespan of organisation forms. In its administrative structure, just as in architectural structure, we are moving from long enduring to temporary forms, from permanence to transience. We are moving from bureaucracy to ad-hocracy. In this way, the accelerative thrust translates itself into organisation. Permanence, one of the identifying characteristics of bureaucracy, is undermined, and we are driven to a relentless conclusion. Man's ties with the invisible geography of organisation turn over more and more rapidly, exactly as do his relationships with things, places, and the human beings who people these ever-changing organisational structures. Just as the new nomads migrate from place to place, man increasingly migrates from organisational structure to organisational structure.